morning, and welcome to the latest edition of the National Security Space Association's SpaceTime interview series. We're glad you could be with us today. My name is Chris Williams, and I'm privileged to serve as chair of the Mormon Center for Space Studies within the association. For those who were able to join us for our recent inaugural Defense and Intelligence Space Conference, thank you very much. We were very pleased to hear from senior national security space officials, including General Dickinson, General Raymond, Director Scalise, Deputy Director Menk, SWAC Director Cox, IC Space Executive Parker, Lieutenant General Gutlein, Indo-PACOM J2 Admiral Studeman, and many others. Today, we're deeply honored to have with us Major General Tom James, Commander of the Joint Task Force Space Defense at Schriever Space Force Base in Colorado. Major General James, welcome, sir. Before the formal introduction of Major General James, however, I'm pleased to announce a slight change in our plan for today's interview. Instead of leading the interview, I'm thrilled to announce that Lieutenant General Kevin Mclaughlin has graciously offered to fill this role today. Lieutenant General Mclaughlin, Kevin, is a highly valued and very active member of the National Security Space Association's Board of Advisors. He served as Deputy Commander of U.S. Cyber Command and also in many critical space-related positions. Equally important, he has worked very closely with Major General James over the course of their distinguished careers. I'm pleased to reunite these two fine gentlemen and warriors. Thanks again for joining us today, Major General James. And Kevin, the floor is yours to introduce and lead the questioning of Major General James. Over to you, Kevin.
Chris, thanks so much for the introduction. And it's an honor to be with all of you here today and an honor to be with Major General James. It's great to be reunited, even though it's virtual. What I would like to do is just do a very short introduction of General James, and then, as was mentioned, we're going to give him an opportunity to make some opening remarks regarding the great organization that he leads, and then we'll get into questions and answers. So prior to the transition to Joint Task Force Space Defense, General James served as U.S. Space Command's Director of Operations. And before that, he was the Commander of Operations Plans and Exercises for the Joint Force Space Component Command and Deputy Commander of the Joint Functional Component Command for Space. And not only does he know a lot about operations, he also has the ability to show other skills. He's also the Director of Space Policy Implementation within the Office of the Undersecretary of Policy and Office of the Secretary of Defense, a very important area as well. Since General James became an Army Space Operations Officer, he's had a number of critical assignments. He was the Corps Plans Officer and Space and Information Operations Officer at Fort Hood. He was a Space and Information Operations Officer at Combined Joint Task Force 180 in Bagram, Afghanistan. He was a Future Operations Planner and Space and Information Operations Officer in Iraq, the Chief of the Space Capabilities Branch within the Directorate of Combat Development at the Army Space and Missile Defense Command, which was also part of Army Forces Strategic Command. General James, he and I first met and served together when he was the Deputy Director of Space Forces for U.S. Central Command. And we both had a chance to serve together and learn from one another in that formative time back during Operations Iraqi and Enduring Freedom. He also served as the Army Liaison Element, the National Security Space Institute in Colorado Springs. He commanded some very important organizations to include the 1st Space Battalion, the 1st Space Brigade, and was the Chief of Space within 3rd Army, Army Central. And then last was the Deputy Director of RSTRAT's Future Warfare Center at Redstone Arsenal. And as you can tell, he has, you could take just a small fraction of General James' space experiences, and he would be in the top few percent of the most experienced space officers, as well as people that have real experience on how space is applied in warfighting, and also how we are moving forward and to meet the future challenges in that domain. And so, General James, thanks for all your service. It's been great to watch you as you move forward in your career and to the difference that you're making, but would love to be able to turn it over to you now for any open remarks that you might wish to make. And after we have these remarks, we'll go to questions and answers. So General James, over to you.
Yes, sir. Thank you for those kind words. Before I say anything else, I want to mention the fact that as an Army space operations officer, and it's typical on the Army side that a space operations officer did something else before they did space. Usually at the mid-grade captain or junior major level, they transition into space operations, but they come from any one of the other fields. And so we don't grow up as space experts. My expertise got its foundation in 2006, as General Mclaughlin mentioned, because I worked for him as a deputy. I worked for General Marty Whalen. I worked for General Hyten, and I worked for General Raymond. And talk about an all-star lineup to be able to get a real experience on space and how to integrate it into combat operations in a very meaningful way, and then see those results in a combat environment was something that really set the conditions for me. That my passion, my desire to understand space more and really make it beneficial in our national security complex, that began with General Mclaughlin. And so, sir, thank you for all of your leadership that you've shown the space community and me personally over the years. Thank you for that. A little bit about my background that wasn't mentioned there because it's a lot, but I do want to talk a little bit about it. I started off as a combat medic, enlisted in the National Guard as a combat medic. It may be my most crucial skill because I feel like I do triage of staff documents all day long. But it also gave me an understanding of how to fit capabilities into combat operations and make them effective at the very beginning. I spent about 4.5 years in the Special Forces team in the National Guard, and then came on active duty as an aviator. And as an aviator, I flew in armored units, 3rd Armored Division in Desert Storm, an infantry unit in Korea, 2nd Infantry Division, and I flew with 160th Special Ops. And that really set a foundation for me as well as I went into space to bring a different perspective, maybe than you see in the pure space operations folks out of the Space Force and all the piece. I had a lot of learning to do, and I was behind the power curve, a lot of the technical aspects of it. But I think it's a good example of trying to marry warfighter culture with where we're going with space capabilities into the future. One of the stories I like to tell, and if you've heard it before, I apologize, but it really is important to me because it applies to the job that I'm in today in a way I did not understand as a lieutenant. But when I fought in Desert Storm, just before we went with an Apache attack battalion over the berm to support 3rd Armored Division's operations, we had a guy drive up in a truck and give us 2 boxes. And he said, these boxes are going to tell you where you are in the desert. And it was important to us because we'd grown up in Germany. We'd deployed out of Germany into Desert Storm, where we had very detailed maps, and we could navigate off of maps very accurately. And in the desert, we were kind of at a loss on how do we navigate. We had some Doppler in some of our helicopters, but they drifted a lot. So these GPS-based systems that they gave to us made a tremendous difference in our fight because we flew in the desert with people who were trying to cause us harm. The terrain's very demanding, and flying at night a good bit of that time. And trying to maintain situational awareness and get our objectives accomplished was difficult. These boxes allowed us to get at that in a way that we didn't know we'd be able to do, and we learned it on the fly, literally. But what we learned was, because there was not a full constellation at the time, part of the day, our pluggers would tell us exactly where we were with great accuracy. Part of the day, we knew that it didn't know where it was at all. Part of the day, it knew where it was. It thought it knew where it was, but it didn't. And so through all of that, we had to figure out how we would maneuver with those systems and understand the technical aspects behind it. But I learned what it meant to have space capabilities and how it greatly improved our combat effectiveness, and then to have that taken away in a minute and then try to fight through that, just through the natural circumstances of the way the constellation was designed then. But it applies today. And if you take space away from the way the United States and our allies plan to fight, it greatly hinders our ability to do our mission. So that's a little bit of my background that got me into the transition into space operations. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of the Joint Task Force Space Defense and how it developed to begin with. And so just a quick trip down history. 1980s is when we saw that space as a warfighting domain was not uncommon to talk about. There are lots of unclassified studies. There's a great RAND book study that I found that was published in the late 1990s that talked about the 1980s and 1990s. But you saw the Soviet Union and the United States as the two competitors in space. With the fall of the wall in early 1990s, about the same time that I was participating in Desert Storm, that competition fell away as the Soviet Union broke apart and lost its ability to really focus as it had before on some of those strategic space systems. And so we experienced a time there of what we would call a benign environment, and we built satellite structures that kind of fell into that regime. In 2001, with the attack on our homeland and our focus on the operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, China and Russia looked back to the events in Desert Storm and saw the advantages we had with space, as fledgling as they were in that fight. And they saw how we use space capabilities in the fights in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think the adversaries took away two major ideas. That they want those capabilities, they understand the advantages that they bring, and they understand if they want to fight the United States, they need to find ways to take those advantages away from us. And so that kind of set the conditions that we saw through the early 2000s that ended with, or led to the Chinese destruction of a satellite on orbit and their test in 2007. A huge debris pattern, not good responsible behavior in space. The United States was able to mitigate the danger of a satellite coming back out of orbit, hitting it with a missile, and demonstrate that we can do that, but it was to protect the Earth from potential hazardous chemicals, and it was done in a very professional, responsible way to minimize debris. From 2007 to 2014, we watched China and Russia continue to develop those capabilities. And every time there was an event like the Chinese attack on the Sohn satellite in 2007, the United States struggled, in my opinion, to respond to those, to understand how do we get all the right people together to respond to that, and what should we be doing to develop capabilities to identify those potential attacks on satellites and to determine what are we going to do to protect those satellites. And in 2014, after the Russians had completed one of their tests, Deputy Secretary of Defense at the time, the Honorable Bob Work, along with the Director of the NRO, Betty Sapp, and the Principal Deputy Director of the DNI, Stephanie O'Sullivan, along with Admiral Haney from STRATCOM and senior leaders like General Raymond, General Hyten, and others, came together and said, we've got to have a better way to get at this. We're too disparate. We need to get all the right players together in the same place so that they can bring in their expertise and have their stake represented in the space enterprise. And what came out of that was the Joint Interagency Combined Space Operations Center, the JICSPOC, which stood up in 2014 and 2015 as an experiment and began a series of experiments to determine what should it look like, what should its capabilities be, how do you command and control a unit like this that's interagency with a national focus for space defense. And so that continued to build itself. At the same time, other things were occurring in the space enterprise. That was the transition of the JFCC space to JFSCC space under STRATCOM under General Hyten's leadership. And I won't go into the details of all of that. I can if someone has that as a question, but that's an interesting part of our history as well. And that continued to morph into what was going to be a sub-unified command and became eventually the unified command of United States Space Command in 2019. As it stood up, General Raymond had looked at how does he manage two major missions for U.S. Space Command. One is providing space capabilities to the theater, to the warfighters, and ensure that that's going to be there. And then how does he protect and defend assets from those capabilities that we just talked about that Russia and China were beginning to develop and experiment with. And what came out of that was the organization of what had been the CSPOC Operations Center became the Combined Forces Space Component Command, which is led by Major General Deanna Burt, my partner in space operations out at Vandenberg, and then the Joint Task Force Space Defense, which stood up here at Schriever Space Force Base. In the interim, the JICSPOC had become the National Space Defense Center to more correctly identify its national mission and how it ties in with critical partners. From the intel community, there's a footprint in the Joint Task Force Space Defense floor where we have 6 of our 18 intelligence agencies are represented every day on the floor. And then we have close coordination with the rest of the intel community virtually. We have the NRO, which is critical to how we operate, and they are embedded on the floor, a total of almost 20 folks, and that number kind of ebbs and flows. But they're absolutely critical for how we operate, and they're not just an L&O cell. They are integrated into the different parts of our staff sections. And then you have the DOD, and you have all of the services are represented on the side of the JTF and on the floor of the JTF. And so that gives you just a little bit of the idea of how we were established. We went full 24/7 operations in 2018 with the stand-up of the JTF simultaneous with SpaceCom stand-up. In 2019, we began full operations, so still less than 3 years old, and we're still growing into our mission. We learn a lot every day. We have a culture that is based on approaching our mission from a warfighter's perspective, and one of innovation, and how do we make the most of the resources that we have, and how we identify the resources that we need to promulgate our mission into the future to ensure that we can protect access to and from space, which is absolutely critical to the way that the United States military and allies will fight, and it's critical to the United States' way of life, quite frankly. And so that's some of the critical, I think, steps that got us to what we have today is the JTF. Our mission is tied very tightly, nested with my boss, General Dickinson's mission, U.S. SpaceCom, and that is in unified action with our mission partners, which I just talked to some of them, but it's bigger than just the IC and the NRO. We deter aggression, defend our capabilities, and defeat adversaries throughout the conflict continuum in order to gain and maintain space superiority. And we can talk a little bit about what space superiority means as we go through our discussion today. But I want to anchor a little bit on the idea of deterrence, because what we really focus on is how do we deter conflict from extending into space. And that's a difficult problem set when you look at all the things that can affect you in space. What does that mean from the ground segment to the link segment to the on-orbit piece? How do you defend that from start to finish? It's a complex problem set, but it's not just, we don't just approach deterrence from how do we deter conflict from staying into space. We also are an integral part of the Department of Defense, the Secretary of Defense integrated deterrence planning. And so we do operations quite a bit with the combatant commands, the other geographical combatant commands, to work with them to help to develop those processes in place that allow us to be part of that integrated deterrence and global operations. That's a big part of what we focus on. And SpaceCom and JTF as part of SpaceCom is uniquely postured to bring that idea of global integration. Every day we're looking at our area of operations, 100 kilometers above the Earth and beyond, established in the Unified Command Plan, is a global approach. And so that's, I think that gives us a unique perspective to bring into the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of Defense's idea of global integrated operations and integrated deterrence. We have 3 main areas, mission areas that we focus on. The first is space domain awareness. The bottom line there is just like maritime domain awareness or air domain awareness, is we need to be able to see or sense and understand better and faster in our environment than the adversary does. If you can't do that, you really don't, you're not at a good position to begin to gain superiority in your domain. And so that's a big part of what we do. There are a lot of advances that we've made in just the last few years, a lot of innovative approaches to use non-traditional sensors combined with our traditional space surveillance network sensors and commercial capabilities. But there are also a lot of gaps, and we continue to look for ways to build upon what we have today to increase our space domain awareness. So once we have space domain awareness, what do we do with that information? So one of our key tasks that we do here at the JTF is we provide indications and warnings to a network of the space community. And that starts with the NRO's Operations Center, the CSPOC, the Combined Space Operations Center at Vandenberg under General Burt, which allows us to get messaging into our allies through the CSPOC, where they tie in tightly with U.S. Space Command for operations. Also through the commercial integration cell to get to the commercial partners. We do that also through our JTF Commercial Operations Center that's here in Colorado Springs at Catalyst Campus. But it's more than that. It's to other government agencies. We talked about the allies. We look for at the classification levels that we can, and that's something we can talk about too, or some of the advantages and disadvantages of how we use classification to both protect our information, but sometimes it's a hindrance to share what we need to. But in a tiered approach, we're able to provide indications and warnings based off of what we discover from our space domain awareness of potential adversaries' actions that are concerning to us in our AOR. And then lastly, we provide command and control for the systems and the capabilities that help us achieve space superiority. And today we think of that not just in capabilities that are take on or belong to combatant commands, and we do that very often. We have good interaction with the other combatant commands, functionals and geographic combatant commands, and we think multi-domain. General Mclaughlin has a huge background in cyber, and we work with cyber a lot to see what are the that is coordinated and driven for timing and tempo at the operational level through the National Space Defense Center, which is our operations center for the Joint Task Force Space Defense. That is probably more context than everybody wanted, but that's all very important to me. And I wanted to put that out there at least as a framework for our discussion as we go forward. And I am always open to people that have follow-up questions or comments about any of that we didn't get to enough detail in. I will talk about our troopers, our space troopers at JTFSD and the work that we do as much as you can stand it. And so with that, sir, I will pause there and turn it over to you for questions.
General James, thanks. A great opening statement in terms of laying out for us both history, but also kind of where you are today. We've got a number of people that are offering up questions, and if those of you who have others based on General James's remarks, please submit them, and we're going to go ahead and get through them. And we'll also, as we go through this, maybe touch on sort of what's on your doorstep, what's coming down the path in the way of challenges, and how are y'all thinking about those? You laid out a really nice history from sort of going from the Joint Interagency Combined Space Operations Center, the JICSPOC, and where you are today. But would you be able to describe, since it's changing so quickly, during that, from that period to today, what have you seen in terms of how the threat in the U.S. space domain has matured or changed, morphed, and then also whether as we think about that threat, how do we include the allies in that cross-check, but between what you do in JTF Space Defense as well as what happens out at Vandenberg under General Burt?
Yes, sir. So the threat, I think, is, I'll talk to that a little bit. I mean, the obvious thing for the threat is that we see it increasing. You see that in open source reporting. There's a lot of examples. General Dickinson just talked to this in his testimony on the Hill of the China's, what I consider, and he said the same thing, is our pacing threat. We see the threats and the activities from Russia today, but in the space AOR in our domain, China is our pacing threat. And you see the work that they've done on their direct ascent, anti-satellite capabilities, for their DN1, their DN2 capabilities. Just recently, we've seen this increased potential threat, just something that we continue to watch closely, of dual use capabilities. And so a threat, how do you determine that? How do you work through the hostile intent or potential hostile act from adversaries? That's a big part of what we do, and I think that's grown significantly since we stood up the JICSPOC in the last 2 or 3 years. The exercises and the work that we do to determine, one is, can we just see and understand through space domain awareness to understand that an adversary has had some negative act on one of our satellites, and then to determine what are the actions that we take in response to that. But prior to that, how do you determine hostile intent? And that's a very complicated process to determine the technical capabilities of systems, But then part of the huge benefit and the real power, I think, of the JTF is the fact that we have such a close relationship with the intelligence community, with the NRO, with different parts of the DoD, to red team and understand as best we can what those potential threats are and the intents of those adversaries or potential adversaries, and then work through what is it that we can do, those actions that we take. And that has grown significantly in the last 2 to 3 years. I talked about how the JICSPOC and then NSDC really grew out of experimentation. And I think that another big part of what we do at JTF, I guess I would add it to the power of our partnerships, is our innovation, our approach to innovation. And we have a sprint advanced concept training, experimentations. We do about 3 or 4 of those a year. And they're focused on the live environment. They use real satellites to replicate potential scenarios so that we can see how well does our space domain awareness work? How do we do command and control? How do we work in our AOR in a realistic approach to be able to counter or mitigate threats? It's key to our protect and defend mission. But what I have seen and what I wish everyone that's on the line here could see, and I see it every day, is the work that our space troopers do to bring innovation, passion for the mission, incredible intellect, and base of experience into the mission. And so we're growing that, and that's growing on a maybe not really exponential, but I'll use the exponential word. It's growing fast. We're learning fast, and how quickly we turn those lessons learned into both our own doctrine, our tactics, techniques, and procedures, our requirements, demands that we put back into the services to get the capabilities we need to fill gaps. I think that has changed significantly in the last 3 years. And all of that in the face of an adversary that is that's moving pretty quickly too. And so if I had to lay out a few things, that would be it. That would be a start. I didn't talk much about the Joint Commercial Operations Cell, but I want to. It's the same thing in the innovation line of thought that we covered. We established the idea of integrating commercial partners for space domain awareness because we certainly had gaps. There was a thirst from the commercial community that said, what can we do to help? What are the areas you need assistance with? And so out of Catalyst Campus, as a catalyst for that effort, we began establishing to be able to reach into commercial capabilities for space domain awareness, and not just the ability to see into space. It's all of it. It's how do you verify the validity of the information that you have. We have companies that help do that part. It's how do you get the information to the right places, along with how do you see into our AOR and understand what's going on. And I mentioned Catalyst Campus in Colorado Springs downtown here, but we have over 80 different corporations or companies that are part of this organizational structure. That's an AFRL-led effort by Dr. Emily Boner, who runs the part of AFRL that runs that for us. But it's all over the world. And we also have this as an area, to your comment about allies, is we've had a series of partners from different nations, from South America, from Europe, from across the globe, that have come and looked and seen the capabilities. They're already looking at how they can help provide some of the support that we need, and how do they tie into that to better understand space environment activities as well. And that is, to me, it is a study in how innovation can go right in the Department of Defense. I'm very proud of the work that the team there's done. And I think it's a good example of, to your question, things that have evolved just in the last few years since the stand-up of the Joint Task Force Space Defense. Sure, if that answers your question.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you. You said we could spend a lot of time talking about your troopers that you have within Joint Task Force Space Defense. So if I could just pull on that thread just a bit. Could you tell us a little bit about two things? One is kind of what's the blend of your military and civilian and contractor workforce? But then second, as you rapidly mature and learn more and more about operations in this domain, how do you think about the sort of the blend of what you might do within the JTF, what might happen within U.S. Space Command, and then what your other partners, whether they're the services or others, where do you kind of turn to as you want to mature that force, your troopers' background and experiences? How do you think about kind of the trajectory that you would be on from that perspective, and who you collaborate with to make it happen?
Yeah, so great question. A couple of things in there. I'll start with our workforce consists of just over 300 folks, a little more than 300, but about half of that's contractor. And that's part of that's because that's the way the JICSPOC had to stand up in 2014 and 2015. And then we've worked to get billets assigned. Of the other half of that workforce, about a third of that is DoD civilians, and 2/3 of that is uniform. And that's a mix of Army, a good chunk of Army, obviously Space Force and Air Force expertise. And that's intelligence, that's space operations. Some of it is joint fires types of experience, command and control. We've got some of the all-domain expertise from the Air Force that's part of our organizational structure. We have a good Navy footprint here. We fought hard to get a Marine back into organization, and we did, and it was worth it. We got a fantastic representative from the U.S. Marine Corps who's doing terrific work for us. And all of that experience brings a different part of the puzzle that we put together. And the idea that if we all came from a very common background, I think we would not be as effective as we are today. And I think that lays a foundation for what may become a more normalized path as the Space Force continues to grow and it develops its culture and experience. I think we're going to feed a lot into that. And so we learn a lot from the Space Force as it stands up as well. Our DoD civilians also have a pretty significant, a wide array of backgrounds they bring. And the contractor force allows us to tailor to some degree what the skill sets are that we're looking for, that we need. And we learn, we change. I will tell you that there is something significant that we learn every week that's new, that we didn't know, that we didn't understand. But it's because we're continuing to, we have a philosophy of persistent engagement in our AOR. And that continuing to push allows us to learn rapidly as we go. For partnering, I'll tell you that we do a tremendous partnering with CIFSIC today, and there's parts of our missions that clearly overlap in their theater support mission with our protect and defend mission, our AOR. And we have a very close connection, and we learn from each other, from lessons learned from their theater support piece, and then what we see. And we work problem sets together all the time, very closely. I'm proud of the relationship that we have between CIFSIC and the Joint Task Force Space Defense. I didn't talk about the NRO as part of that blend. I guess I did up at the front of that, but the NRO is absolutely critical, along with our intel community partners. I had good discussion with our senior NRO representative that's embedded in the JTF yesterday on a problem set, and brought a perspective to it that I don't think that I would have thought of, and others in our organization would have thought of. And so there's a lot of cross sharing from different fields of expertise in the space enterprise. So I think that that's an area that we continue to grow on and build on in examining what our force should look like. I think you touched on a little bit of, what is the culture? What should a space trooper or a member of the Joint Task Force Space Defense really think of, or how should they approach their mission set? And, I'll throw some easy ideas out there that I know you've heard before, but just the difference of moving a satellite versus maneuvering a satellite. Delta V versus, am I doing this to gain a position of advantage in relation to an adversary to make myself more resilient, to better protect and defend my systems? And so we make a point of talking in those types of language. I talk the 9 principles of war and how they apply, and in some cases maybe they don't apply to our unique environment, but we make a point of making ourselves talk in that type of lexicon for 2 reasons. One, it makes us approach the mission differently, and I think in the right way. But it also makes it easier for us to talk with other combatant commands And you probably remember our travels down into Iraq and Afghanistan and trying to explain space stuff and talking in terms of defensive counter space and offensive counter space, and you lose people pretty quickly. And so being able to talk in joint lexicon and in warfighter language about those things that we're trying to accomplish, I think is really important. Within the Joint Task Force, we go through a book every 2 or 3 months that focuses on warfighting. We've looked at Peter Singer's Ghost Fleet, which is, I think he calls that fictional intelligence, but it really is important and very space heavy. I don't want to give anything away if you haven't read the book, but it leads to interesting conversations about our missionary in a way that maybe we can't get to outside of some of the exercises and experimentation that we do. I've also taken the JTF through Kill Chain by Brose, which is a great book to think about, are we developing the way that we should be in technology? How we used to do it in the past, how we do it today, is it right? Both of those books have a focus on China, again, our pacing threat from our perspective. And we're currently going through a book, Destined for War by Graham Allison, who one of the books that I read in SAS was the essence of decision-making that he wrote about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he brings some of that into his book on, it's focused on China and the potential that the United States and China could have conflict. And he goes all the way back to the Peloponnesian War and Thucydides, fear, honor, interest, all of that, of what causes nation states to go to conflict to begin with. It's a great book to read through. We're going to have our discussion on that book tomorrow, but the purpose of that is to continue to lay a groundwork for us to think in terms of warfighting at the strategic and the operational level and down to the tactical level in some cases. But it also gives us a common lexicon and understanding where we can talk about events that happen in relation to some of the things we've read or discussed before. So all that is just small parts of trying to continue to develop the culture that I think is going to be absolutely critical in terms of how we approach warfighting concepts, philosophies, our innovation, the importance to get after that, how we manage our resources as effectively as we can to achieve our objectives, and how do we continue to build and grow ourselves so that we don't become stagnant, because this environment that we're in will not allow that. You have to continue to move forward, or Darwinism will take over and you will wilt. And so all of that is helping to set a culture and a mindset for the way we approach what in the 90s was more seen as a benign environment to operate in the space AOR. So I don't know if I got off topic or if that answers your question, or if that leads to any more questions.
It was a great answer and very clear. A lot that 300 people are able to do, especially when they approach it the way that you're describing. General James, you've talked a little bit about space domain awareness and its importance. You've talked about all the things you're doing from an innovative framework to bring commercial and other capabilities into it. Certainly, it's been mentioned recently by General Dickinson as he's testified as a top priority and his top shortfall. But there's another area that's been focused on quite a bit as needing work over the recent years, and that is sort of foundational intelligence on not only our foreign threats in space, but also in the indications and warning arena. Can you talk a little bit about what your assessment of kind of where we are today and whether we're on a trajectory that gives you comfort moving forward?
So to your comment about foundational intelligence, I think that the community as a whole does great work on foundational intelligence, and we are working with the Intel community all the time to better understand that. Ops Intel is an area that we focused on, and I should have included in my discussion of what's changed over the last 2 to 3 years. And that is a tremendous area of focus. There are a lot of challenges there, as it is in any domain, to get at the right level of Ops Intel. But we have got a really good organizational structure that's developing both inside the JTF SD, and then as SpaceCom has continued to grow itself out, and General Gagnon, who was leading our J2 efforts at U.S. Space Command, has built a really good capability there to advance us to the next level of ops intel, all the way into advanced targeting and all the difficulties that you have along those lines. But a lot of that comes back to us, the operational area of space domain awareness. I know we've talked about it, and yes, absolutely, that's General Dickinson's number one priority, is to understand our environment, and that sets the foundation for everything else we do. If I could just real quick, this is something that came to me as I was thinking about Mr. Williams, Chris Williams' background, that he worked with Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld at the time of the Rumsfeld Commission in 2000, 2001. And one of the key things that it highlighted back then was the idea of a space Pearl Harbor, that we could have an attack, a surprise attack, because we didn't have the right intel in place, not necessarily foundational, but the ops intel piece. And then the space domain awareness that helps feed us from an operational information piece to stay ahead of that curve. Well, just recently, I was at Pearl Harbor, oddly enough, and it had me thinking about the story that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, of the radar systems they had in place at Pearl Harbor, and that they detected, someone was doing training on the system, and they detected hundreds of dots. There's things out there, and they discarded it. Plausible that it was another series of aircraft coming from mainland United States, or maybe defects in the system. But we had information that could have allowed us to react much better, and potentially, I don't want to do too much counterfactual, completely change the beginning of that part of the war, World War II. But it didn't, for a couple of different reasons. One, the capability had some gaps, and it wasn't didn't provide the information as user-friendly as it could have. That developed over time. The crews probably weren't trained to the level they needed to be, and I'm not being pejorative or trying to say they didn't do it. I think they just foundationally, they didn't have the environment in place to allow them to do what they needed to do, and then the staff didn't have the processes in place to take the information and know what to do with that. And so back to your question of the space domain awareness and ops intel, what's critical to us is all of that, to continue to push on the capabilities that allow us to get the information, but then maybe more importantly are those training processes, and then our day-to-day processes that allow us to use that information at the decision-making level quickly, with confidence in the validity of the information. If you juxtapose that with the same time frame, but the Battle of Britain, and when we talked about the JTF standing up, I made this analogy, and I like it. It's got some holes in it, like any heuristic or analogy, but if you look at the fighter command in 1936 that stood up because they could see the threat, unlike Hawaii, which that threat wasn't as obvious, the threat's right across the channel. It's growing, coming out of the Spanish Civil War. You've seen the German forces begin to build. You see what Blitzkrieg starts to look like. And Hugh Downing got the task to build a force to defend against that. But he didn't get priorities. He didn't get a lot of resources. But he did some ingenious things. Innovation is the kind of things that we try to focus on. And that was with their classified system of radar. How do I operationalize that? How do I mix that with coastal watchers? How do I bring all that information into one place, Bletchley Park, where he was very ingenious in how he used the Auxiliary Air Force. It was a female-based organization as part of the British Air Force. And they did the work to take that information and operationalize it. And that's a critical part of what we've got to look at in both the ops intel and in our space domain awareness, is not just getting the information, it's how do we operationalize that, and then have the command and control, and then tie that to capabilities that can do something about it. He worked very hard on developing the right fighters and Hurricanes and Spitfires to be able to defend against the German onslaught. That's an example of where much better than what we did in the Hawaiian example or the Pearl Harbor example. And I was thinking about that a lot just as I spent time on the Missouri and reflected back on the sacrifices that the U.S. Sailors and soldiers and airmen had to go through, partly because we didn't have things postured as well as we could have. I don't want to be in a position where we're surprised like that in our AOR. And so the ops intel piece is critically important. How we integrate all those different technologies quickly is really important. One other key lesson in that, I think, and this is a casual observation, I haven't done study on that, but is how well did we partner with our allies to understand the lessons that Britain had learned in the summer and fall of 1940 that could have applied a year later for us in December of 1941. And that's another area that we work closely on, to partner and learn and grow together as a community to get the most effect that we can out of all the different avenues to understand both our environment from just what's there and what's it doing, and then what are the potential threats from an ops intel perspective. A longer answer than I meant to provide. I apologize for that. But again, I told you, I can talk about this topic for a long time, very passionate about this, and along with General Dickinson's direction and his guidance and his vision, we see the absolute importance of being able to protect and defend our access to our space capabilities, the importance that has for the way we're going to fight in the future, the way we fight today, and just the general impact it has on the American way of life, our economy, our information systems, our banking, financial industry, all of that. And so that's apologize for a little bit longer answer than I meant to give, but there you go.
No, thank you. That's a great answer. Just as I just would mention as an aside, you sort of compared and contrasted Pearl Harbor example and then the RAF's example of what they saw in their preparation for World War II in the air domain. I like that you had your command read Ghost Fleet. You know, and also sort of an example. In some cases, I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but a failure of imagination to connect dots of things that are there for everyone to see, and at times they're seen, and other times they weren't seen by the leadership in place. So that book was just a fictitious but a great. I'm sure your team got a lot out of it. It's a book I use in my teaching at Texas A&M. So back to questions. We've talked about General Dickinson's priorities and his shortfalls, and you've mentioned it even just in your last few remarks. But as one of his senior commanders, do you have influence on those broad sort of those tools that are available to a combatant commander that have been important in other commands, such as his integrated priority list, unfunded priorities, urgent needs? Is the process or framework such that you feed into that? I don't know that you could speak to the substance of any of that, but it would be interesting to know whether the role that you might play and how you see those tools as something that could be effective for the command.
No, that's a great question, because unlike most joint task force that I'm aware of, and I've served in several in combat, and served at the CFLIC level and the CFAC level as well in different organizations, we do have a requirement, if you will, to make requirements in the acquisition and the capability development community, because no one is really focused on the mission the way that we are. We partner closely with Space Force, SSC, with Mr. Cox's group to look at capabilities and help define the requirements that we see for future capabilities. Absolutely work closely with the SpaceCom J8, who owns the requirements for General Dickinson, and I've had many discussions with General Dickinson on capabilities and prioritizations, hard decisions to make when you have limited resources to get after some of the things that we think that we need to focus on and make the right prioritization. We have great insight there. We use General Whiting. We feed him requirements in his Space Force hat as he takes that back into some of the acquisition forums that he participates with. So I think we have a great opportunity to push that. We do have some opportunities under SpaceCom's oversight to work with the industry out there to talk about requirements that we have. I'll tell you that if there were a few things that I were going to mention to some of our folks that are listening today about capabilities that we're most concerned about, and sir, if you don't mind, I'll just hit a couple.
Yeah.
That I think in kind of a general sense, but you know, just the accuracy of our data. When you talk about space domain awareness is our number one requirement. We have to have states of specific accuracy, positive identification that gives us good signature data information and dissemination of that data. A lot of what we do is similar to the missile warning and the missile defense missions, but there are differences in that. And so what we're looking for in terms of accuracy is to understand, and this might lose some folks here, but just covariance reports, and to get that to a level that we're more comfortable with, that we really understand, along with data delivery timelines. We've transitioned from TLE predictions on objects to maintaining positive custody of objects. That's a task that some of our systems weren't really developed for. We've learned how to use them to get those effects, but we need dedicated systems that really look at both the accuracy and timelines, and then data format. You know, we've talked two-line elements since I've been a space officer, probably since you've been a space officer. But you know, that started with 80-column punch cards to communicate ephemeris information to sensor sites. And we're past that in some ways, but there's a lot that we've got to work on, things like vector covariance messages, those types of things to help us really, if you think that we're going to end up fighting, or we're going to have to do protect and defend missions, even beyond GEO, think cislunar, and I mean, just a little bit of singers looking into the future. We've got to get ahead of the way that we operate today. And so that's an area that we put requirements into both the SpaceCom J8 and just in a general sense. For space domain awareness, we have some significant gaps. And so we look for ways that we can increase our coverage over the Southern Hemisphere and West Asia into PACOM. And I'll tell you another area that's really important to us is automation, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. We talked about the number of people that is required to do our mission. Our mission is pretty complex and has a high demand for people power that I don't think we can continue to work those systems in a manual way that we do today. That we've got to automate those systems. We've got to really tie into artificial intelligence to allow us to move faster, to allow us to move with more accuracy, and to let us be able to accomplish the mission with the people power that we have here today. So that's a couple of things I would throw out that's on our mind of areas to improve on, and that we absolutely are tied in with General Dickinson's prioritized list of capabilities, and we have, I think, pretty effective ways to be able to influence all that. Our J8 at the JTF and the J8 at US SpaceCom have a very close working relationship. And then we continue to push that at the action officer level and at the senior leadership level, because the kit the capabilities that we have to be able to do the mission, you know, we need to continue to press on those, because our adversary is absolutely not standing still.
Great. I appreciate that. And we have time for just maybe two more questions. The first, you've mentioned the close relationship and partnership in a couple of different instances between JTF-SD and the CIFSIC at Vandenberg. As just sort of as you think about, I don't know if the right word is doctrinally, or you know, sort of how habitually those two components may work together in the future, or do you see that interaction becoming more formal going forward, or do you think it would just stay agile and I'm not saying episodic as a pejorative term, but you know, you will adjust as needed in terms of what your interaction might be?
And so I do see that changing and growing. I see it continue to be strong. You mean the interaction between JTF and CIFSIC today?
Yes, that's correct.
And so I tell you what we do learn is General Burt and I learn when we do that right, and we get the right teams together, and we are able to team on problem sets, that the outcome's much better than we would have anticipated. And that's pretty standard outcome of when we were able to sit down and really work together, because we have incredible people that are trying to get at the mission. Some of the bureaucratic inefficiencies or inertia that you might see trying to work that through different stovepipes and then coordinate that as an outcome are overcome by the fact that we began that planning early, just like you saw in planning downrange. At the beginning of the MDMP process, you got to be at mission analysis. You got to be there at the beginning, and that drives how efficient and effective you are at the outcome of your product, of your planning process. And so we see that. I see that continuing to get tighter and tighter. I think as the Space Force continues to grow and we see some of the capability stand up with units that don't exist today that will in what I believe will be the near future, that we'll see an even closer interaction because of the work that General Bratton will do at STARCOM to develop doctrine and the TTPs, along with systems development out of the Space Force. There'll be more and more of a lead of that ability, with still an important input from the joint parts of both those organizations. But absolutely, I see that as the right way to push forward, and I think that's exactly the path we're on. And I think that if we have this discussion a year from now, I'll be able to talk to you about significant advances we made from where we are today, if the recent past is any indicator at all.
Great. Well, thank you. For our last question, and the coins may run out at the top of the hour and everybody disappears, but like in the cyber area, there's a lot of discussion about the responsibility of the government and the DoD to help protect or defend sort of non-military infrastructure in civil, commercial, or international area. There's similar questions regarding on the space side, protection and defense of civil and commercial and international coalition space assets. Can you talk about where we are with either guidance and authorities that you have or that U.S. Space Command might have that's delegated to you, or work still to do in that broad thinking of sort of national economic security arena versus just pure defense focused?
And so I think I'd have to put my policy hat back on a little bit from OSD to talk to some of that. And so I'll tell you, that's an area that we look at in our exercises. And so certainly we've looked at the problem set of how do we protect and defend more than just what you might think of a top list of high value assets from U.S. satellites. We absolutely have included that in our work. I think the answer to your question, though, is there's still work to be done on the policy side to understand all the processes in place. I will tell you, down at our level, at the space trooper level, operational level, we have the ability to provide some of that capability, just as General Burt does, and she works closely with the allies from her position at Vandenberg. But I think that's probably an area that I don't want to get ahead of where OSD and others are on that topic. It's something that we absolutely think about all the time, and we look at how would we execute those types of operations and do that. So we've laid some of the base tactical and operational level work. It's an area that I think will continue to grow traction as we move forward. If you just look at all the different countries that have established their version of a Space Force or a Space Command or a space-focused part of their organizations, and then the reliance that all of our allies have on each other's satellites, that's probably a natural fruition of where we'll be. But clearly work to be done.
Great. General James, I personally, and I think all the audience could sit here and interact with you for the next day. And I would imagine you've already destroyed your calendar just by spending an hour with us. So thank you so much. It was informative. It was personally pleasurable to be able to see you and to just to hear your views on these important issues. And we all look forward to being able to continue to watch the command move forward and the progress that, to be honest, your troopers are making under your leadership. So thank you very much. We appreciate the time, and we look forward to the next time we're able to be together.
And I want to thank you and Chris Williams for the work, and the NSSA folks for the work you do, providing a forum that allows us to have these type of discussions. I look forward to the time that we're not on TV, that we can all sit in a room and have more of a discussion than a briefing type format, and that's coming, and I look forward to that. But thank you for what you do.
Absolutely. Take care, General James, out here from the National Security Space Association.